This is 2018's Outlaw King. Warning, spoilers ahead. We open up to a burning candle and the history lesson on how Scotland was occupied by King Edward I of England, and about a failed rebellion led by Sir William Wallace. That's right, the one Mel Gibson played in Braveheart. As the camera moves away from the candle, we see Robert the Bruce surrenders to Edward I. The king calls Robert and John Comyn and demands them to shake their hands and leave their claims to the throne behind them both. As Robert was about to leave, he was approached by the king's heir, Edward II, who decided to challenge him to a spar. Right before the Highness's butt was about to get kicked, Prince Edward was called by King Edward for some parenting. Yeah, that kind of parenting causes all sorts of daddy issues. You know, like, I'm gonna prove to him I'm worthy of his crown, while just hoping to get his attention and love. Not a guy you'd want to see in charge of a kingdom, that's for sure. Anyway, that father-son conversation was interrupted by a priest telling the king there's another petitioner, James Douglas, who came to demand his land and title back. King was about to give an order to kill him, but the priest stepped in and quickly walked James to the exit. Outside, the king decided to demonstrate to Robert and other Scottish nobility his new weapon and launched a fireball into the castle. Show off! Later that evening, there's a party where it's been announced that Robert will marry the king's goddaughter, Elizabeth de Burgh. The next day, Edward leaves Scotland. Robert with his father and brothers return to their castle. At the table, the men of the family have a fight about whether it was the right decision to surrender, but Robert shuts everyone up, saying it was father's decision to make. Later that day, Elizabeth arrives. It's revealed that Robert's first wife died giving birth to his daughter Marjorie, and Marjorie is curious how she should call her new stepmom. As Elizabeth arrives at the castle, Robert looks stunned by her beauty. After somewhat awkward welcoming, she goes to greet Marjorie and they both seem to like each other. Then there goes a boring wedding ceremony followed by a huge party later that evening. A priest approaches the newlyweds to prepare them for their first night together, and that's when the whole party starts to applaud. Wow, that's quite a reaction. Oh, and Prince Edward gives a rather questionable illustration with a stuffed pig and a candlestick, which I can't show you. This man belongs in some mental facility, not the throne. As the priest finishes his prayers and leaves, Robert and Elizabeth sit there awkwardly until Robert thanks her for making it through a rough day and leaves to his bedroom. Elizabeth exhales with relief. Points to Robert for his chivalrousness. In the morning, Robert, Elizabeth, and Marjorie go to the castle square where people gathered to pay taxes to King Edward. Suddenly, English soldiers rush in and start taking men to the army. Robert tries to calm people down, saying it's their duty before the king, but when a young boy was taken, Elizabeth slaps one of the soldiers, reminding him she's a daughter of their senior marshal and demands soldiers to release the boy. And obviously they obey. Robert goes to check on Elizabeth and praises her for being brave back on the square. She asks if that's all he wanted to say and shuts the door in front of him. Oh, I know this type of women who flirt like this. And men fall for it, always. The next day, Elizabeth plays with Marjorie around the castle, while Robert and his father do some paperwork. After it's done, his father tells Robert how he fought alongside Edward in the Crusade, but now he fears that he made a mistake trusting him. After those words, Robert's father passes away. Right after the funeral, Robert has to deliver taxes to the king. This is where he finds out that William Wallace was quartered. So then, the riot ensues. As soon as he got back home, he convinced his brothers to rebel against King Edward once more. Surprisingly, Elizabeth supports him in this decision, and they kiss for the first time. There you go! That's a good start. Don't overthink it now, Robert. The following day, he meets with John Comyn in the church to try to convince him to leave their disagreements regarding the Scottish throne for later, after they free Scotland from the English. But John threatens to tell the king about Robert's plan, so Robert stabs him in a split second. That's right! Rats only end up like this! Robert and his men rush to the main headquarters of the Scottish Church as killing a man in the church is a forbidden sin. So after his confession, he was waiting for the verdict. To Robert's surprise, the whole Scottish Church decides to support Robert's inauguration as King of Scotland if he gives his word to support the Scottish Church. King Edward finds out about Robert killing John Comyn and his upcoming inauguration, so he appoints his son to kill Robert, mentioning that there's no need for chivalry. Later, Robert tries to convince Scottish lords to support his inauguration, but most seem not very happy about it as nobody wants to start another war, especially against the king's army. Before moving out to inauguration, Robert thanks Elizabeth for supporting him, and she says that it's her duty as a wife. He gives her a flower to cheer her up. Smooth! I think I know where this is going with all this chivalry stuff, but we'll see. On their way to Scone, they meet James Douglas, who swears his allegiance to Robert and asks for his name and his land in return. While Robert's inauguration is happening, Edward knights his son before sending him to war with Robert. Robert's man reports to him that De Valence, brother-in-law to Comyn, tries to move against him before the prince arrives, so they meet on the battlefield in Perth. To avoid bloodshed, Robert challenges De Valence to a duel, but De Valence delays the duel for the next day as it's Sunday and De Valence claims to be religious. At the night camp, Robert gets some wine and goes to chat with his wife. After quite a heartwarming conversation, Elizabeth takes him to their tent for their actual first night this time. That's a perfect way to wish your husband good luck before a possibly deadly duel. Later that night, Elizabeth sings a lullaby to Marjorie. And before you ask, no, the kid wasn't there the whole time. We could actually see her in the camp before, but this editing caught me off guard for a second as well. Robert comes in to talk to Elizabeth, but they're interrupted by screaming outside. Oh, that religious bastard attacks them at night. Knew that. Robert's chivalrousness played a bad joke on him. Never trust a man who came to kill you. Robert sends his wife and daughter with his brother Nigel to Lord Frasid in Kildremy, who is supposed to get them to France. De Valence and his soldiers burst in and start killing everyone. Robert and his men try to fight back, but eventually they have to retreat. After the battle, De Valence sets a bounty on Robert. After giving their horses to hurt men, Angus offers Robert to go to Islay, his home, to regroup, and Robert agrees. On their way, they meet Lord MacDougall and his men. It's obvious that MacDougall is not very keen on the new King of Scotland, especially since Robert killed his cousin Comyn. Eventually, they go their separate ways. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, Marjorie, and Nigel make it to Lord Fraser, and he welcomes them at Kildremy. Robert and his men make it to Loch Ryan, which they have to cross to get to Islay, but there's just one boat that was okay, so they have to go back and forth a few times to bring everyone to the other side. Robert hops in with the first group, and once there, he notices another boat, but it's too small. While standing on shore, he spots MacDougall and his men approaching Robert's men on the other side, and he screams to warn them. He hops into that small boat and rushes to help his men. Well, that's a true king, a true leader who's ready to sacrifice his life for his people. Respect for that. In a battle, Robert's brother Alexander gets killed. They take all the men who survived on the boats and escape. Prince Edward arrives in Scotland and blames Valence for losing Robert, even though he had an upper hand. Valence's man arrives, saying that he found Robert's wife and daughter, and Edwards and Valence lead their army to Kildremy Castle. Nigel hides Elizabeth and Marjorie, but when Edward takes over the castle, his men find them. Edward hands Nigel for treason and offers mercy to Lord Fraser if he gives up Robert's location. After Fraser refuses, Edward kills him too. Edward really pisses me off. He's so obsessed with his power, but deep down he knows he doesn't deserve it. I doubt he'll last long as a king. That's the kind of king who gets stabbed by one of their closest friends. He seizes the castle and everything in it and takes Elizabeth and Marjorie to London as hostages. Robert and his men finally reach the shore of Islay, where Lord Mackinnon already waits for them. Angus tries to convince Mackinnon to join forces, but he refuses. Robert believes that he'll change his mind eventually, and he'll be waiting. They go back to the boat to sail down the shore to Agnes's village. Once there, Agnes is welcomed with a good old slap from his wife, as Agnes promised to be gone for 3 weeks, while it's been 4 months. He delivers the news about Robert being a new king of Scotland. Then there's a welcome party by the fire, but we see James sneaking from the party with a girl. In the morning, during the training, it appears that the girl was actually Agnes's daughter, and he's not very happy about James hanging out with her. James kisses him just to piss him off and has some laughs. In London, Sister comes into the cell to take Marjorie to their church. Obviously, she doesn't want to part with Elizabeth, but it's not like they have a choice. Back in the village, we see James hanging out with Agnes's other daughter. Dude's got nerve. Or suicidal tendencies. He sits down with Robert. They see Agnes approaching and James prepares himself for the worst. But it turns out Agnes came to tell Robert that Kildremy has fallen and that his wife and daughter were taken. Robert has some hard time processing it. As they sail back, James tells Robert that thinking about revenge tears the soul, but it can be used as a weapon. Robert says that he's done with chivalry and they fight like wolves now. Finally! I guess that's one of the main points of this movie. You can win the hearts of people with chivalry, but you can't win a war with it. Enemies will always play dirty. Once back, they meet Ian on his way to Robert's castle. They hide in his cart covered with wood to get inside the castle unseen. They fight English soldiers and take back the castle just to burn it as a symbol of rebellion. On their way out, James asks Robert for permission to take his father's castle himself, and Robert gives him 5 men to assist. James and his men sneak into church and kill English soldiers during the Mass. Then he invites his people to the castle where they have a feast that was meant for the English. And afterwards, James burns his castle as well. Back in London, the king's men deliver him news about Robert's rebellion, and Edward shows his dissatisfaction with his son, which obviously hurts the feelings of his maniac boy. Meanwhile, in Scotland, after seizing another castle, Robert meets Drew, who survived Valence's attack that night. Moreover, he managed to save Robert's crown. Robert tells Drew to keep it, and Drew promises to guard it with his life. Oh no, I have a bad feeling, but I hope I'm wrong. Elizabeth is being taken to meet her parents, but our maniac boy comes in and ruins the moment again. He says that he'll give her a chance to be free if she signs the papers that renounce her title of a queen and her marriage will be annulled. They try to force her into signing, but she refuses. And here we go. Maniac boy goes nuts again, and she still stands her ground. What a woman. Robert is a very lucky man. The prince decides to punish her and hang her in a cage on the castle wall. The king decides to lead the army himself, but starts to feel bad and falls from the horse right after arriving in Scotland. Before dying, he once again says his compliments to his son and demands that he take the king's body to every battle. After that, he dies, and Edward Jr. looks happier than ever. Being the son of the year, he orders to bury the king right there. Meanwhile, Robert and his men are watching the English approaching up the hill, and they move out to prepare for the battle. Since the English army is composed almost entirely of cavalry, Robert picks a swampy place for a fight, and they dig a ditch to build a wall of spears inside. When more men came to help, they were surprised to see their king digging the ditch with everyone else. Later, James with a few men stops the whole army to throw Robert's gauntlet at them and tell the new king that they'll fight them tomorrow under Loudon Hill. Chivalry again? I thought they were beyond that. Well, I hope this time is not going to be like the last one. At night, Eddie and Valley have a lovely talk about how they like each other. Damn, I'm curious if they're going to stab each other in the backs later. At Robert's camp, they try to go through their tactics as Edward has 6 times more men than they have. After that, McKinnon shows up and wants to join Robert. Robert has no issues with that and welcomes him as a brother. Then the morning comes. Edward decides to give a typical tyrant speech before the battle. Like Robert's true aim is to actually take over England and other senseless stuff. Robert, meanwhile, in his own style, gives a speech about honor, but how today they have to be the beasts. Seems like James took these words too literally. That's a crazy friend's look, who turns into a beast in every bar fight. Then the battle begins. The rain starts as if nature is on Robert's side. Robert's men pretend to retreat while waiting for the English cavalry to fall into the ditch with the spears. And it works. Trying to assault the flanks, the cavalry gets stuck in the mud as expected. The Scots emerge victorious against the bewildered English soldiers, and James personally takes down the noble to whom King Edward has awarded his family's lands. Understanding the hopelessness of the battle, De Valence commands a retreat. But our maniac boy Eddie, blinded by obsession, doesn't retreat and rushes to try and kill Robert. He duels Robert and fails. He vomits in fear and cries for help while running away. Ah, Robert, you're too soft-hearted. I'd kill that madman while there was a chance. It might have solved an issue for good. The Scots cheer the victory, but Robert spots Drew dying from a spear while still guarding the crown. Ah, it's sad that I was right, but that's how script writing works. If someone says, "with my life," I wouldn't attach to that character too deeply. As everyone gathers after the battle, the titles on screen tell us how James got his land back, and Eddie the maniac boy was killed by his own nobles a few years later. Ha! I'm glad I was right about this one, though. But praises to the great acting. I really hated the character. And at the end, it is said that Elizabeth was released during a prisoner exchange and they raised a family together. Marjorie was back with them as well. And lastly, 300 years later, Robert's descendant James VI became the king of both England and Scotland. Then the credits roll. As for the movie, I count that as a happy ending. From a historical point of view, I'm not an expert, so I wait for all the historians in the comments section. I really enjoyed the movie and exceptional acting. It has this old school movie vibe to me, which is rarely there nowadays. Give it a shot. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.